Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Metroid Prime Remastered. In the last part, we went through a lot of the game's areas, namely Phendrana Drifts, but also Town Overworld and the others, getting a lot more items done in the process, wiping Phendrana out completely in the process if memory serves. And now we're back in the Phazon Mines once again, this time for our final main lap through the area to get what we can. Now, I mentioned at the last part there's a shortcut, but I'm not going to be taking it because early on here in this next room, there's actually an item we can get now that we have the plasma beam and power bombs at the same time. So we're going to be focusing on that. But the shortcut I'm talking about, like I mentioned at the end of the last part, you might remember when we first came to the Phazon Mines, there was that crane we interacted with to get that one missile tank. When it's in its normal position, you can use it as a grapple point to swing across the way to a little bit of an aquarium-like morph ball tunnel, actually, that you can use to get to the room where the giant three-sectioned rotating tower is that use the morph ball bombs to actually rotate. That is a pretty handy shortcut because it does cut out like the first third or so of the Phazon Mines, but I need to come this way for a couple of items, unfortunately. This is maybe a case where if the game has a little more open with what order you could do some power-ups, that maybe it would be more approachable to go through things in certain orders, but because the game's relatively linear in terms of the actual power progression, there's not much you can really do. I think the only time in the game you actively have a choice of what power to go for next is charge beam or morph ball bombs. And it makes me wonder if in development there were more intentional sequence breaks that they just had to cut out for reasons. And here we get the final of the super missile combos, the flamethrower. It's not that good. The plasma beam itself already has a good enough damage rate that it can really outpace a lot of the main beam missile combos to begin with. But the flamethrower works like the wave buster in that you shoot it out and then it continuously drains missiles after the fact. It takes about 10 missiles to fire and then 5 per second afterwards. And not for nothing, it can do some pretty good damage, especially on groups of enemies. But for boss fights, you want those missiles for literally anything else, particularly super missiles or the ice spreader. Its lack of lock-on also just makes it relatively tricky to use, and yeah, it's just kind of worthless in my eyes. The most we're going to be using it for is nothing. I use literally every other super missile combo. I don't use the flamethrower at all. I do like that in that elevator, though, you can see how far you are down the impact crater at this point. It's a nice little way to show how far you've come, but also makes you realize we really do only explore a very localized portion of Talon 4 in this game. Like, in Super Metroid and Zero Mission, you're kind of implied to explore, like, a majority of the planet, or at least a relatively large region. Prime is pretty localized. Same with Prime 2. Prime 3 is literally different planets, though. I think the planet we probably explored the most of in the series is, honestly, SR388, and because that's the main cavern region, supposedly, for the planet. But even then, that's, like, only where the Metroids are. I'm kind of surprised that all 50-some-odd Metroids total were all in one cave system, at the end of the day, thinking back. Not for nothing, though, on the second visit to the Phazon Mines, they do try to spice things up, because while the troopers are all still in their usual places, they're going to have a few extra elite pirates here and there in case you haven't scanned them yet. And I think you do need to fight this one. I think the moment it breaks out, the doors get locked. So hey, I guess if you haven't scanned locked doors yet, do that. But again, that's only if you really want to get the 100% scan book, because it really doesn't do a lot besides concept art in the main folder. Alright, so here we are back where we got the power bomb. And I'm saving here mostly just as a refresh in case I took too much damage. But you do want to save at the same time because the next portion of Phazon Mines that we couldn't explore on our first visit does have some pretty high damage potential in it. In particular because, get this, there's going to be Phazon in the Phazon Mines. And these here are the boxes I actually brought up when we were first here in the Phazon Mines, where you can get very easy power bomb drops, basically guaranteed from all 3. And that was actually a good way for me to confirm whether or not I actually had all 8 power bombs or not. You got enough assault turrets in one room there, Space Pirates? I'm actually not even sure of how... It's really hard to get out of this little area without getting hit by them when you try to scan the little computer that just turns off the turrets. I love this next room so much. Metroids and Space Pirates separated only by a force field. What if I turn it off? So the unfortunate thing is the moment they do that, the one that's closer to the stairway does realize you're there, so you're probably not even going to get to see the Metroids attack the Space Pirates, but when it happens, it really is funny. I'm kind of sad they didn't really do this as much in the sequels to begin with, or at least lean on it more than as much as they could have, but it's cool. So now we're in the actual Phazon mining part of the Phazon Mines, and there are a lot of Metroids here. Usual still applies, you can super missile them to death, but at this point either use a power bomb or the ice beam missile combo to take them out in a faster pace. It is kind of funny how the Prime series in some regards kind of makes Metroids feel less important in the long run because they're sort of just normal enemies. Even with the various mutations they get throughout the trilogy, like, there's just so many different types that it's kind of ridiculous. Whereas there was the one Metroid that nearly ended the universe several times, had it gotten into the wrong hands in the main timeline. I say main timeline as if these games aren't canon anymore. And like I said earlier in the LP, that is slightly duplicitous to begin with, but I like to think these games are canon, especially with what they're building up to with Prime 4 and Federation Force. So here, even in the earliest portions of Phazon Mines, you can see why you really do want the X-ray visor, because there's a lot of invisible platforms over the Phazon, and it's around here you'll notice that the Phazon is especially high damage. I brought it up when we saw that first little crate near the crashed frigate, but Phazon works as a hazard like lava in that it accelerates in damage the further you're in it, the longer you're in it. But it accelerates extraordinarily fast here in Prime Remastered. In fact, they actually accelerated it for the remake, to the point of making a certain pickup that you could get early theoretically in the original release impossible to get early in the remake. Also, there's a burrower here for some reason. Kind of late to throw those enemies at us, but oh well. I find these elevators a little funny, though, because if you look on the map, you can see there's like a little arrow just on the bottom of it, on the top right of the screen, kind of pointing downwards. There are some times in the game when the Metroid Prime maps don't exactly line up correctly, so they have those to point you into the direction that you're actually going to from there room-wise. So, like, now we're all the way down here. I guess it could be connected to, like, loading and all that, because I do believe the way Metroid Prime tends to work is the rooms directly around you are usually loaded, but the textures don't load until you hit the door or something like that. Also, take a dip into Phazon real quick there to grab that missile tank. You're technically supposed to wait until the next power to get that, but you can get it now. You're not going to be in there long enough to take a lot of damage. And here are some more Hunter Metroids. This is where they're supposed to be, overall. And that's why people think the one at the Phendrana's Edge isn't really meant to be there. It was originally just an error that they kept in for the remake because it was classic or something. Although I do believe there is potential logic in it being there for, like, the Space Pirates testing it or something like that. This area is interesting, though, because in the original game, this area was extraordinarily dark visually. It was very hard to see anything, barring the glowing Phazon. It made for a nice atmosphere, and that's still here in the remake. But because of how light reflects now, you can see so much more easily around what's going on, and I gotta say, I prefer that. Although, according to some people, they think the game overall here in Prime Remastered is darker than the original game. And there's some rooms I can see it just because of how light reflects off stuff, but overall, I think the game is easier to see in now. This is probably still the darkest room of the game, no matter what version you're playing. Also, hearing that death scream of the Metroid reminded me, if you came as far as the area where we undid the force field for the Metroids on your first visit to Phazon Mines, unleashing those Metroids would actually cause others to spawn in earlier rooms in the area. For instance, the aforementioned gigantic spider ball track tower made up of 3 pieces you rotate room would have Metroids there now. That missile tank took me forever to find on my first playthrough because I just couldn't see that that was a power bombable thing. Kinda sucks, but oh well. Now, platforming in this room can be a little tight, not so much because of the mushrooms we're jumping on, but because of the glider. On your first instinct, you might think you might want to go for the door on the right as your first door, because that is where progress is. What's over here is just one of the few missile recharge stations in the game. But you want to come this way first anyway because of how the grapple beam works and where the glider would be. It's possible to make it to the far red door, but it's a very tight squeeze and jump, so I recommend jumping over here, then using the glider to get to a mushroom next to where that other door is, right across the way from here. Yeah, because now we can jump over here, and then we can make the jumps a lot more easily. Because almost every time I've tried to make the jump over to this mushroom to start, I miss like 80% of the time. It takes like 3 or 4 tries at the least. This room's weird. I don't go into my X-ray visor to show it off, but there's invisible pulse bombos here for some reason. And when you kill them, they stay dead. At least it feels like they stay dead, unless they just change the spawns there, period. Either way, here we got the final of the 4 trooper types in the game, the plasma troopers. They're only in a couple rooms, but thankfully they spawn infinitely. But they do allow me to talk about something I forgot to mention with the plasma beam. If you charge your plasma beam and hit an enemy with it, and they survive the pure damage up front, they'll be lit on fire and they'll take damage over time for a short period. Usually they won't survive it, but if they do, I guess you can just hit up with another charge attack. Again, plasma beam, pretty good. The biggest problem with it overall is probably that still, even with its low rate of fire, it takes a while to get somewhere compared to like the power beam or wave beam. It and the ice beam are definitely the slower beams in both rate of fire and traveling speed, but their damage is just so worth it. Incoming. Oh, wow. Hey, scans. It's been a while. Unique Phazon readings analyzed. Ooh, wow. I wonder where it could be. High levels of Phazon radiation nearby. You don't say. On my practice playthrough, that scan didn't show up at all because I got here, I guess, like 2 rooms earlier or something. I was actually kind of miffed that I got that close to there without it going off. I guess it kind of echoes what I brought up when I was getting my ice beam, where I got that literally in the next room to it. Ooh, the final pirate data. Log 11.369.4. As we continue to observe the development of Project Helix's elite pirates, it becomes increasingly obvious that these warriors will usher in a new era of space pirate dominance. They are incredibly resistant to damage, and their ability to transport and wield so many weapons at once makes them the ideal mainstays for our ground forces. Though they are not as quick as typical pirates, it makes little difference. With a platoon of elite pirates in the vanguard of an army of normal and flying pirates, we will have a near indestructible backbone that should turn the tide in any engagement. Maybe we should go kill these things, Oh yeah, they brought that Omega pirate in that one log earlier in the game. I wonder if we're gonna have to deal with that at all, huh? They are actually bringing up several weaknesses for the next boss fight overall. But before you go up to the top floor of this room to progress on, we actually want to come over here because this is where the 3rd and final save room is for the Phazon Mines. And at this point, especially if you're lower on energy tanks than I am, it's probably going to be good to get the health restore. It's kind of funny thinking back, though, because we've gone through this area pretty quickly. Not only did I die here a lot as a kid, but I mentioned earlier in the LP that there were several parts of the game that scared me. And these included, like, when the Fendrana pirate base goes dark, encountering my first Metroid, the crashed frigate. Phazon Mines was easily the scariest part of the game to me. I think it came down to the fact I just didn't like the sound effects the space pirates made. Because it is kind of low and growly, and this was at an age where a lot of Buffy episodes scared me, even though that show does get admittedly kind of intense at times. Alright, let's go. Next boss fight's only 2 rooms away, and this room's kind of funny because all it is a single plasma trooper and a pipe you need to melt with your plasma beam anyway. But something that's kind of funny, the next boss is in this room, but you can actually scan them before the fight starts up, and I'm glad they kept this in Remake, because it means I'll have more time to actually talk about the boss fight. Just kind of edge closer. There we go. This is the Omega Pirate, most powerful of the elite pirate forces. Omega Pirate can become invisible to normal sight. It is vulnerable when cloaked, as all energy is drawn from defense systems. By exposing itself to Phazon, it can regenerate damaged tissue and organs. Considered the pinnacle of the elite pirate program, this enemy should be handled with extreme caution and maximum firepower. Indeed, we shall. So by and large, the Omega Pirate is just a larger elite, but it's got a lot of armor on it that you need to break off. A single power bomb can do this, but otherwise you need to rely on super missiles to do that and normal missiles like it is an elite pirate. It can still absorb stuff towards its claws and hit you with giant shockwaves and punches and kicks. It's a high damage boss fight, but when all of its armor is depleted, it will then turn invisible and flee, spawning several troopers to try and ignore you. At this point, it'll teleport randomly to one of the 3 Phazon pools around the room and start regenerating its armor one piece at a time very quickly. This is when it's vulnerable to attacks by usually using super missiles or power bombs. I recommend super missiles because they're just faster. And then it'll teleport again to try and resume the process. It never teleports to the same Phazon pool twice in a row, so you can face away from that one and just look and listen for where he's going to teleport next. I think it only takes 3 or 4 super missiles to kill him, so if you're quick about this fight, it can be over pretty quickly. But if he gets his armor back, he'll be back on the attack and be very aggressive and can damage you pretty quickly as well. Be careful of this fight. It can be rough if you're new to it, but otherwise it can be pretty quick. Phazon suit acquired. Our defense is now at its highest, even having a little barrier around it, and now we will no longer take damage from Phazon at all. It's like a little swimming pool now. Ooh, blueberry flavored. With that said, interesting note, that cutscene was changed from the original GameCube versions, I think starting with like Revision 2 or the PAL release? In the original release, when the Omega Pirate lands on Samus, she emerges from the Phazon kind of like writhing in pain, but then goes into that one marketing pose where she's pointing her camera to the side, sort of aiming. It's essentially, I think it's one of her side taunts from Smash Brothers? But for PAL, they gave her that more inquisitive animation, which probably is more fitting given the situation, but I won't lie, the original pose was also really cool. But now we're backtracking for reasons, and here we got a Fission Metroid. Metroid with the ability to split into 2 forms. The Fission Metroid is a mutant capable of splitting in 2. This split endows the creatures with invulnerability to most weaponry. This effect is unstable, resulting in a weakness to a type of weapon fire. The vulnerability appears to be random due to the chaotic nature of Phazon mutation. These normally only spawned in the end game area in the original version of the game, but they added them in this portion of the Phazon Mines after beating the Omega Pirate. These are interesting enemies in that they're a normal, they start vulnerable to all weapons, but when they split in 2, they randomly split into 2 different colors representative of the beams, and each color Metroid is only vulnerable to that color. It's not a separate scan, thankfully. But power bombs are a good way to kill them all the same. And I tried to show it off there a little bit. If a Metroid tries to go through an open door in this game, no matter what type of Metroid it is, it dies instantly. It's funny. So now we've come back to this Morph Ball tunnel because this giant bunch of Phazon here leads to the final artifact for the Phazon Mines. If you had every energy tank in the game, you could do this without the Phazon suit, I believe, in all prior versions of Metroid Prime. It was really tight, but you could. But here in Remastered, they apparently accelerated the rate at which Phazon damages you, so it is now completely impossible. And now we're just going to speed back up towards where the Mega Pirate Room was, just because that's the last thing we need in this section of the Phazon Mines. I never need to come back here. There are still a few items here in Phazon Mines, namely 1 missile tank and an energy tank, but those are on our path. Don't worry about it. This suit, though, I associate the game a lot with it, but you don't have it for that long in retrospect. I guess it is just because nowadays I know the level design well enough that I don't need to do a lot of active backtracking, but as a kid, I had this suit for basically the entire key hunt several times in a row. And it's just, to me, it's as iconic as Samus's base Various suit to me, color scheme-wise. Hey, get off me! Dick. The Prime series definitely has some really good suit designs, even when it's just color palette swaps. The dark and light suit from Prime 2 are really good. I like the PED suit, but I get why people don't in Prime 3. I'm really curious if we're going to get any completely original suits again in Prime 4, if they're going to play it a little more on the safe side with just like the usual power, varia, gravity, things like that. Because, getting a little ahead of myself, I'm really curious in what direction they could take Prime 4's story, because what the ongoing story more or less had been, barring Prime Hunters, had been resolved in Prime 3. So unless they were building something up with Prime Hunters and Federation Force in specific regarding a certain character, I guess we'll find out. It is kind of weird that it's been several years now since even they announced the restarting of development and we have heard nothing since. And I know that's a very common criticism, but it really is weird they've been this quiet. I'm assuming, based off how many people are continuously hiring, that it's just a massive project and they want it to be potentially the best Metroid game for the 3D stuff, counting Dread as a 2D game, because even though it's 3D animation-wise and graphically, it is by and large the 2D structure. So this gigantic room you could actually find earlier through two methods. One, there is a morph ball tunnel from another room that you can get to with power bombs and the ice beam that would lead here, and that would allow you to get this missile expansion earlier. But also, the aforementioned second elevator in Phazon Mines leads down here. With that said, as you saw where we got the energy tank, there's a door that locks, so you couldn't actively come to the Omega Pirate from behind in any circumstance, unfortunately. Unless there's some speedrun strat to get past that door, in which case, you know what, there probably isn't the GameCube version. Out of bounds is common enough in that. But I'm going to take advantage of that other elevator just to go to the Magmore Caverns, because some of the last items I need I can get to more easily by going that way than by heading over to Talon Overworld. The Phazon Mines can definitely be a draining experience to play through on a first playthrough of the game, and even on repeat runs, it's definitely still the hardest part of the game to revisit. Partially because of how long it is, partially because of the save point starvation, partially because it's the most combat-oriented section of the game. Like, yeah, every section has a couple rooms that lock and a couple of boss fights, but this area is mostly boss fight, little exploration, and for that, it's definitely the most draining. Not for nothing, even though I like them having some combat sections here and there just to kind of diversify it, having it go on this long is a little rough, and I'm glad it seems like from memory Prime 2 by and large realized that, because the straight-up combat sections in that game, barring Dark Commandos, are more front-loaded and generally shorter in length. That game does a decent job at mixing the combat and exploration a bit better than this one, on top of its better level design in terms of the rough structure of it. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 14, we go collect our final notes of completion before heading off towards Endgame. See you guys then.